Hello, welcome to the first lecture of our class for the spring semester dealing with Prajnaparamita. I'm happy to have all of you in the class and hope that it's a productive and interesting time for you. In this class, we will be exploring the family of texts known as the perfection of wisdom, Prajnaparamita. The importance of these particular texts is that they represented the period in Buddhist history when the teachings were put into written form rather than being an oral system based on memory. The content of the sutras, known as perfection of wisdom, helped to usher in what came to be identified as Mahayana, with major methodological shifts and innovative ways of expressing the teachings of the tradition. These texts challenge us to find meaningful approaches to the analysis and study of their content, as well as seeking to comprehend their historical context. I'm going to suggest we should consider some of the questions about the context before we read the sutra passages. There are rather pressing matters, since there is a constant question of whether Mahayana represents a later development in Buddhism that is not directly tied to the words of the founder. What are we reading when we open the Prajnaparamita? Make no mistake, there is much that we do not know about Buddhist sutras, whether in Pali or Sanskrit. We have little knowledge of who made the redactions that I see before me on palm leaves, paper, or stone. Currently, the hope of identifying the time when the text first existed in the form that I am reading is based on finding a physical copy and date of when it was made. When Buddhism spread beyond the confines of India and was introduced into the literate society of China, we have translations that are identified by the names of those who made the version and a date when the work was done. From this perspective, the earliest recorded example of a perfection of wisdom sutra is a translation done by Lokshema in 179 of the Common Era in Chang'an. Now, the trail of the history of the text that Lokshema used is not available to us. Archaeological finds of fragments of birch bark manuscripts in Inner Asia give us some clues about the nature of texts in the 1st century of the Common Era. Nevertheless, the preservation of that 2nd century Chinese translation of the full text remains our earliest major source for study of this form of Buddhist teaching. The Chinese translation can only tell us one part of the story. When the text was first written down, and when the teaching was first put forward as an expression of the Buddhist tradition, are not dates that we can fix with any assurance based on the Chinese translations. For those who took the course on Maritime Buddhism, you may remember that I found evidence of 4 major systems along the route that saw Buddhism spread from South Asia to Southeast Asia and on to China and the lands of East Asia. These four systems were: 1. Early Buddhism, with its relic veneration, construction of stupas, art in the form of narrative and iconic images, and memory of the oral teaching of the founder. This was followed by the appearance of the written text, especially those of the perfection of wisdom that mark the record of Mahayana. The latter two systems were those of Tantra and Reformed Theravada. Thus we find that wisdom literature belongs to what we may refer to as the Mahayana system. How shall we study this Mahayana? Was it for certain a system? If Mahayana was a system, what was its characteristics? Was it in fact not just a system, but beyond that, a system of systems? And what is the definition of a system? Can we use our study of the perfection of wisdom text to further our understanding of how systems are developed and how they fulfill a purpose? Scholars have argued for nearly a century over the location of the original home of Mahayana. Evidence has been found for its appearance in the northwestern regions of India, and just as convincing, the claim that it originated in the coastal centers of Southeast India. These are two sites far distant from one another, and we have no accounts of how contact between the two regions was made by land routes across hundreds of miles. Again, in reference to the course on maritime Buddhism, I've stated that the two distinct sites associated with Mahayana belong to a system of sea trade and communication. Mercantile activity was taking place along the coast of India, starting in the far northwest of the Indus Valley Basin, linking ports all the way to the eastern and southern coastal cities. Thus, asking the question of whether Mahayana rose in the northwest or the southeast may be misleading. It seems more likely that Mahayana developed within the maritime systems that span the entire coastal rim of the subcontinent. This view of Mahayana as part of a system of trade, communication, and social structure associated with the maritime world may also be helpful in answering another question. Since reference to writing appears for the first time in Buddhist texts among the Mahayana Sutras, so who taught the Buddhists to read and write? The early Buddhists were centered on oral recitation and memory of the words attributed to the Buddha. King Ashoka's inscriptions are the earliest examples of writing in India. The words were carved on polished stone pillars and rock formations. The Brahmanic tradition seems to have had no interest in writing and continued during the time of the appearance of Mahayana text to be totally focused on memory and recitation. The most likely source of the practice of writing on portable palm leaves was the merchant community of maritime trade. They were making large shipments of goods in vessels that carried tons of cargo long distances. Now, we are fortunate to have a first century example of a written document concerning the shipment of goods from the west coast of India to Egypt for transshipment down the Nile to Alexandria and the Roman world of the Mediterranean. In this written artifact, we read the inventory of goods shipped, the route taken by the movement of sea and river, and the terms of payment. It seems that if we look at Mahayana as a system of teachings recorded in writing, found along the maritime trade route, it gives us a glimpse of how a scribal formation of redacted text may have been constructed and circulated. As mentioned, the oldest version of a complete Perfection of Wisdom Sutra is found in China, translated by a monk from Inner Asia who brought the document by caravan route. So it is the trade routes, both by sea and caravan, that were the conduits for the spread of Mahayana texts. While we can speculate with some degree of assurance about the way in which Mahayana made its way in the subcontinent, as well as through the land routes to the capital of the Han Dynasty of China, we're still left with the issue of who put these texts together. The Perfection of Wisdom in 8,000 lines, translated first by Lokakshema and later appearing in 6 other versions in China, is a complex and lengthy text. As already mentioned, we're still unable to discern the exact procedure for the production of the volume taken to China in the 2nd century. It is a volume that contained sophisticated use of technical terms and a philosophical discourse that combines these technical words together. The teaching is presented in the literary form of dialogue, in which all the words are attributed to the Buddha, one of his disciples, as well as devas such as Shakra. Now, putting this dialogue into a form that we find in Sanskrit, Chinese, and Tibetan was no easy task. Now, from the text itself, we can determine that it was done by monastics. Among the scholarly debates, another one continues over whether these monastics were forest dwellers, or residents of established centers in cities. The major figure in the group described as having dialogue with one another is the disciple of the Buddha, Subhuti. Now he, along with the other disciples in the text, is mentioned in the recitations of early Buddhism. However, in the Pali Canon, he has very little involvement in the teaching and often appears only in a list of disciples. His major claim to fame is that he was identified as the foremost disciple of forest life. Now, the issue is muddied a bit by the alternative reading of his accomplishment. The word for his position of importance has also been translated the foremost of those living in calm, meditative practice or stillness. So if we take up the first epithet of the foremost of those in the forest, then it could be argued that the perfection of wisdom came from monks who wandered in the wilderness. From this perspective, Subhuti would be a voice from outside the walls of the city monasteries. Now, the problem we still face is to determine how wandering ascetics, living the most austere life isolated in the jungles, could have managed to construct long written passages of teaching with technical issues. One might say that there's a difference between the giving of the teachings and the construction of written documents. So did the forest dwellers teach, and later the city monastics took the teachings and put them into written form? If we look at the sutra itself, we find the lament that monks in the city are not seen as being spiritually equal to their cohorts wandering in the solitude of the forest. The text tells us that this argument over the superiority of forest dwellers compared to those who lived a more sedentary life in urban monasteries was fully at play when the sutra was constructed. It would appear that the one responsible for the written form of the sutra identified with city monastics and believed them to be at least the equal of wanderers. The idea that monks in the forest were more pure than those in the towns is rejected. Some of the strongest language in the sutra is used to reject those who look down on other monks because of where they practice. The text says that any monk who would make such a distinction between forest dwellers and monastic personnel is, and I quote, a low-class chandala of a bodhisattva. Know that they are filthy, stinking, defiled, and impure. One should know that this person is a charlatan bodhisattva. Know that they are the greatest rogues in the world with its gods and human beings, a thief in the guise of a shramana. Well, these emotional, one might go so far as to say intemperate words in the sutra, suggests that this issue was a major one and feelings ran strong over it. Our contemporary debate is an extension of one that dates back to the earliest written texts. If the perfection of wisdom texts form a system, it would mean that they have an approach and purpose that is distinct to them, rather than just a further expansion of the form of Buddhism that we might term as early Buddhism. As we read the contents, you will want to keep this question in mind. That is, are these texts teaching something that is not found in the early Buddhist oral tradition? Or from another perspective, are these texts collaborative with the earliest teachings? Now, collaborative would mean that the construction of the perfection of wisdom text was not intended to be a rejection of that oral memory, but an extension of the teaching. Did the redactors of this written form of Buddhist teachings see their work as a fuller description of the meaning of the remembered words attributed to the Buddha? I do not imply that the answer to such a question is an easy one. When does a description or interpretation go beyond the original intention and become something new? If one compares this to the Greek version of the Christian Bible, the question has been similar. Can one say that the letters written by Paul years after the time of the original teachings carried exactly the same message as the first 4 books called the Gospels? Well, what I'm suggesting is that we use the lens of systems to understand the complexity of Buddhism with the hope that it will allow us to have new ways of study that will make the religion more understandable within human discourse in history. Does it help us to identify the perfection of wisdom as a system in its own right, and as one of the systems that made up Mahayana? If it's so, we can take the position that Buddhism itself is a system. And as we look at the Prajnaparamita, if we see them also a system, then we can assert that Mahayana and Buddhism are both a system of systems. For example, the computer is in many ways a system of systems. It has within it a disk drive that is itself a system, operating at one level with functions that are independent from all the other systems within the computer. This can be taken back to our subject in this course. Can the Mahayana text represent a system that operated independently of any other discourses, while at the same time being an integral part of another system? Shankar in 1994 that is more than 2 decades ago, used the term array rather than system. He makes this case for seeing networks of systems as an array that function together to achieve a common goal. Using such a method, the question of the role of Mahayana texts in the history of Buddhism can be explored not as a break with early Buddhism, but the two are viewed as systems functioning independently at one level and at another functioning together with a shared goal. When the Chinese pilgrims came to India, they were surprised to find that monasteries had monks of differing heritages living side by side in harmony. Monks self-identifying as Mahayanist were able to reside in monasteries built for those who limited their canonic material to the received content of the early Buddhism. Monks who relied on the perfection of wisdom texts were not seen as opponents by the monastics who opened their doors to them. The later years of hardening a divide between so-called Hinayana and Mahayana does not seem to reflect the realities of a time when systems of thought and practice could be different and yet remain collaborative. In this course, we will have an opportunity to read the literature that appeared in written form in the early centuries of the Common Era. And these explorations can give us a chance to make up our own minds about the ways to interpret what we read in the Perfection of Wisdom text. Looking at the information through the lens of systems will make the task more complex. However, we may be able to recognize new patterns and perhaps see Buddhist history and development in a more nuanced manner, making it more understandable. So I look forward to our collaboration in this course. Thank you very much.